Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our unit on ecology and evolution. We have completed the whole ecology portion, so now we're going to jump right into evolution and talk about what is it, what is some evidence for it, what's some examples. So let's dive right on in. The learning objectives are pretty straightforward today, so you can pause the video and take a look at those. And here are all the key terms that we will be discussing. So first, to discuss a note on what a scientific theory is. So this doesn't often come up in other areas of science or even biology. However, a lot of times when it comes to evolutionary theory and the theory of natural selection, there's a lot of people who like to say, well, evolution is just a theory. Well, a theory in science is a well-supported explanation. It's been repeatedly confirmed by evidence, observations, etc. And it describes an aspect of the natural world in a way that allows us to make predictions. So it's highly supported, lots of evidence backing it up, and whatever the theory is, it helps us make predictions. So usually it requires that a hypothesis or a group of hypotheses are well supported through multiple studies or multiple experiments. Other examples of scientific theories include the theory of gravity, atomic theory, that the universe, all matter is made up of atoms, the cell theory, which says that every living thing is made up of cells. So why don't we call these things laws? Well, laws are a different thing in science than a theory. Just like an observation is different from a hypothesis, is different from data, et cetera, et cetera. So laws only describe observed phenomenon. They describe what happens. They don't explain what causes the thing to happen or why the thing exists. That's where you get into what a theory does. So now that we've covered that base, let's move on. So what is evolution exactly? It is basically just a change in inherited characteristics of a group of organisms over multiple generations, or over time usually. And it's all based on adaptations. These are changes in traits that make an organism usually more suited to its environment. And the traits are going to be versions of different genes. So things like different eye color, different heights, different strengths, ability to swim better, hold your breath longer, things like that. Those are all different traits linked to genes, and they lead to adaptations. Maybe holding your breath longer allows you to be more suited in a more aquatic environment, so that's an adaptation. Other things include webbed limbs, or some type of like paddle limb for swimming, feathers for flying, things like that. So an adaptation usually helps an organism become more fit, and biological fitness just means the ability to pass on your genes. Are you able to survive long enough that you can reproduce and your genetic material then moves on to the next generation? That's what fitness is. So part of evolution explains that if we can see how changes over time have accumulated in all of our different species, then it stands to reason that all life evolved from a single cell, and we call that our common ancestor. We have multiple different common ancestors. There's one common ancestor cell that spawned all life today. There's a common ancestor that spawned all eukaryotic cells like animals and plants and fungi and all of that. There's a common ancestor that all mammals come from. So there's many different common ancestors, but the idea is that we have some organism that first developed these traits or these genes that ended up becoming all the organisms that evolved from that particular one. So let's first start with talking about Darwin and natural selection. So prior to Darwin, the idea was that species were created exactly as they are seen today, and that they do not change and that they do not die out. This really started to be challenged by the scientific world with a geologist named James Hutton. So he noticed that, well, the Earth itself gradually changes over great periods of time. Things like water can erode rock until you have a gigantic canyon like the Grand Canyon. And he laid the foundation for this next scientist, Charles Lyell. He laid the foundation for his work in geology, where he hypothesized that gradual changes formed the Earth, and that gradual changes are still occurring to Earth today and will continue to shape the way the Earth looks. And this led to what they call the old Earth hypothesis, that no longer did we see the Earth as relatively young, but that in order for some of these things to exist geologically, like mountains and valleys and ravines, that the Earth is significantly older than we thought it was. Now, on the biological side of things, we had a philosopher named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he first hypothesized that organisms could change over time. But he had it based on this idea of use and disuse, that there was characteristics that organisms had that would either get stronger or disappear. So he believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics. You can pass any modification that happens to you onto your offspring. So what he argued was that if you had a particular population of organisms and they only lived in an area with very tall trees and they wanted to eat from those very tall trees, they would try to stretch their necks as far as they could to reach all of that vegetation. Well, over time, that stretching of the neck would make the offspring of these organisms have slightly longer necks, and over time, they would just have longer and longer necks. And whatever organism failed to adapt just died out. Well, this isn't quite true, because then if we cut off a mouse's tail, we would expect all of its offspring to have no tails. Or if you have pierced ears, then you would expect all of your children to have pierced ears. So it's not quite the way it works. There is something that we're going to talk about in the genetics component of the class a little bit later called epigenetics, and it kind of validates Lamarck a little bit. However, real evolution through natural selection does not work this way. We will explain how it works in a little bit. So this brings us to Charles Darwin himself. And when he was a young gentleman, he went on a trip around the world serving as the biologist on one of the British vessels, the HMS Beagle. And he ended up traveling around South America, Australia, the Ecuador and South America in general, the Galapagos Islands. And he first started to see all of the geological evidence that supported Hutton, who said, oh, there's these gradual changes to Earth over time, so Earth is older than it seems. He also saw many incredible unique organisms. He saw different fossils for living and extinct creatures. And he noticed that wherever he went, organisms seemed to have adaptations that helped them survive best in their environment. So this led to his development of the theory of natural selection. He didn't publish this until 20 years later, and it was actually because at the same time, right around the 20 years later, another scientist on his own voyage through Indonesia was coming up with the same idea. And he reached out to Darwin and was like, hey, I kind of figured this out. And Darwin said, oh, well, I did a long time ago. I've just been afraid to publish it. So I'm going to publish it really quick, and then you can say whatever you want about it. So Charles Darwin observed many fascinating things, and we're going to go through some of them just to understand how he came to the idea of natural selection. One of the things that he noticed were the tortoises on the different islands of the Galapagos off the coast of Ecuador. So he noticed that the shape and size of the neck, as well as the shape and size of the shell itself on these tortoises varied drastically from island to island. And he noticed that whatever particular shape and structure that these tortoises had tended to really match well with their environment. So they would have different vegetation or different terrain that they would have to navigate. And the structure of these tortoises was different based on those availabilities of the nutrients and things like that. He also noticed that there were a lot of organisms that looked kind of the same in many different areas of the world that had a similar climate. For example, he saw ostrich in South Africa, he saw emu in Australia, and he saw things called rhea in South America. And they're all gigantic flightless birds that all look very similar, and they're found in relatively similar conditions. He also saw that there were marine iguanas in the Galapagos. So these are iguanas that dive underwater and eat the algae on the rocks in the ocean. And he's like, well, these look very, very similar to the iguanas on the mainland, but those iguanas don't swim. They're terrestrial only. And he noticed that there was incredible differences in the flora, which are the plant life, and the fauna, the animal life, between areas that are high in water content, like the rainforest, and areas that have less water content, like the Patagonian desert. And he's taking in all of these observations and he's starting to think. Then he started looking at fossils. And he noticed that the fossils were going to be different based on the layers that they were found. Higher up, you have younger fossils. Lower down, you have older fossils. And that kind of makes sense. Things die, they get compacted down, and then over time, more organisms die on top of them. So you have the oldest stuff at the bottom and the newest stuff at the top. And this helps us relatively date organisms. So we can see that there's certain areas like the Himalayas where we find seashells at the top of Mount Everest. And that doesn't make sense because this is the highest mountain on Earth. It's very landlocked in the center of Asia. Why are we finding seashells? Well, that's evidence for these geological progressions where maybe this was ground that was underwater at some point and then geological formations pushed it up. And so you could compare these fossils to their modern day equivalents. And that's kind of what Darwin was doing. He noticed that in places where you had armadillos, you had these fossils of these glyptodons. These are gigantic armadillos. These things are bigger than a human. So he noticed, well, okay, there's fossils of something that looks very similar, but these glyptodons don't exist anymore. Where did they go? He saw the same thing with sloths. Modern sloths are relatively small, whereas these ancient sloths with these fossils that he found, they were much larger than a human being. I think this is about 15 feet long, something along those lines. So he's asking, why are there extinct versions of the same animals where these other animals that look just like them are currently alive? What made those ones go extinct, but these other ones are still living? What made the organism go extinct at all? How did extinction come about if everything was specially created to be serving a purpose on Earth? And then he got probably his most famous insights from the finches. And these are just small songbirds that feed off of seeds. And he found that they had differences in their beak shape, size, and other features to allow them to eat the different vegetation on the islands that they were found. So some birds come from islands that are very arid and dry, and the seeds tend to be spiny or very thick, and they have to have gigantic beaks to be able to get through the spines and to crush these really gigantic seed pods to get at the good food inside. Then he found that there were other islands that were more tropical and they had lots of fruits and the seeds were very plentiful and small and easy to crush, and those islands had birds with very small beaks. So he found that the size and shape of the beak allowed some finches to successfully compete, successfully feed, and successfully then reproduce, and so they were able to pass their traits on to their offspring. So here's just some examples of one of the finches that he actually saw. Here's a cactus eater finch. So it has a really long beak to get in through these spines. You have this seed eater here who has a gigantic, very powerful beak to crush the large seeds. And then a little insect eater, and this one onto the side on the right eats tiny seeds. So they have more tiny, less strong beaks. So all of this led to Darwin forming his idea, the theory of natural selection. And natural selection is just the process where individuals with certain adaptations that are advantageous in their environment survive and reproduce at a higher rate compared to other individuals in the population. Natural selection is the mechanism for how evolution occurs. So it's the tool that allows nature to act on the different genetic traits that we all have. So let's talk a little bit more about what natural selection is and what it all means. So the first point with natural selection is that there are natural variations in the traits of organisms in a population. We can see that in this first panel, the top image here, where you have a bunch of beetles. Some of them are orange, some of them are green. Additionally, populations produce more offspring than can survive. There's more organisms born than there are resources to house and feed all of these organisms. So some of them are going to compete, and whoever competes, there's going to be a winner and a loser. Now, certain traits are going to make one organism more likely to survive. It's going to have an increased fitness compared to others. So when that competition occurs for resources, the bird with the slightly bigger beak will be able to crush the harder seeds better than the bird with the slightly smaller beak. And that leads to the bird with the slightly bigger beak eating, surviving, and being able to reproduce. So the next point is, if the organism survives, it's likely to reproduce. If it reproduces, it passes on its gene of the larger beak size rather than the smaller beak size. So eventually, the entire population is going to shift to having more and more of a larger beak size. So you can see that in this image here. There's variation. We have green and we have orange beetles. Well, the green beetles are the preferred food for some reason for this predator. So over time, more of those green beetles get eaten, and it's an adaptation, a preferential adaptation to be orange. So the orange ones are able to survive. They are the only ones that pass on their genes, and so eventually the entire population is now orange. They've lost that green component to their coloring. Now, the one thing that's important to note is that evolution affects entire populations, not single individuals. We as humans can evolve. I, as a human being, cannot evolve. So I can just have a trait that is more advantageous or less advantageous, but I am not going to be evolving. I just either survive to pass on my trait or I don't. It's then up to the whole of humanity to say, well, these traits are the ones that are surviving more, so eventually humanity is going to have more and more individuals with those preferential traits. So that's exactly what I'm saying here. Natural selection occurs when the environment favors some phenotypes, which are traits, the physical appearance of a trait, over others. So an example is this peppered moth during the Industrial Revolution in England. So this peppered moth has two different colors. They have a darker color that's more black, and they have a white color that's a little bit more mottled gray and white. And they normally rest on these trees that have a mottled gray and white bark. So in this image at the top right, you can see there's a gray and white moth to the right and a black moth to the left. Or maybe you can't see it. That gray and white moth is incredibly well camouflaged. So if you're a predator, it's much easier to spot the darker colored one, and you'll eat that one, and the population will trend more and more towards the gray and white spotted because they're surviving better in their environment. But then during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of coal burning that occurred, and the theory was that all the trees in England started to turn black with soot. And in that case, then these darker colored moths were much harder to see compared to the lighter colored ones. So now it shifted to the darker color being more advantageous. Those ones would survive and reproduce, and the moth population would become more and more darkly colored. So that's the idea of natural selection here. Now, these differences in coloration, are you the black moth or the gray and white speckled moth? Those are due to genetic differences. Mutations arise in what color your wings are going to be, and one organism produces more melanin than another and is black versus gray and white, or other types of traits that evolve. So, to sum all that up, there's natural variation in organisms. There's more organisms that are born than can survive, so there's going to be competition. Certain adaptations make you more fit to survive in your environment, so you will be the one to reproduce and pass on your genes, and eventually more and more of the population will have those advantageous genes. Same thing here. You've got the lightly colored and darker colored mice. This is an actual study that was done. There's a video that I link at the very end where you can see the actual mice in the study where we found this all out. But the volcanic eruption in the area created all this dark stone, and the lightly colored mice were no longer a favored trait because they could be seen easily by aerial predators. So if you were a lighter colored mouse, you were more likely to be seen and eaten. And so over time, the mouse population became more and more darkly colored. So let's discuss some of the types of selection and some of the effects of what that would mean to the different traits that we see. So now, artificial selection is evolution, but it's directed by humans rather than by nature. So natural selection is where the environment selects which traits are favorable. Artificial selection is humans saying, I like that trait, I'm going to then breed these organisms together to favor that trait coming out. So we achieve it through selective breeding. If I like the dog that has black fur more than the dog that has brown fur, I'm going to breed the black furred dog to another dark colored fur dog and only breed those ones and let the brown or yellow colored dogs not breed as often. Same thing with food. We have genetically selectively bred our food and artificially selected our food for thousands of years. In this picture down at the bottom, this original plant up at the top is the plant from which we grew cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, and cauliflower. We just selected different parts of the plant. If you were a person who said, well, I really like the stem and how the stem tastes on this plant, I'm going to breed only the plants that produce really thick, juicy stems, then you eventually created kohlrabi. If you liked the taste of the flowers and you picked ones that produced more flowers or bigger flowers, eventually you produce something like broccoli or cauliflower by only breeding those particular plants. So artificial selection is actually a great piece of evidence for evolution occurring because it shows that evolution can even occur drastically in short periods of time. I mean, to think that a couple thousand years ago, broccoli and cauliflower looked as wildly different as they did is quite surprising. Or a couple thousand years ago, the wolf was the only quote unquote dog that existed, and now we have chihuahuas and pugs that all came from the wolf. That shows how strong selection can be to create evolutionary changes in a population. And then there is sexual selection, where this acts on the reproductive success or the fitness of an organism. And it's affected by how attractive are you to potential mates, your gametes, your sperm and your egg, how healthy are they? How successfully do you rear your offspring? Are you the type of organism that has the offspring and they immediately have to fend for themselves? Or do you protect them for a number of months or years so they have a better chance of surviving to adulthood? So, sexual selection acts only in sexually reproducing species. There are species that just clone themselves by dividing the cell, so this does not refer to them as much. And the whole thing with evolution and natural selection, survival does not matter if you do not go on to reproduce. So you may have an adaptation that allows you to survive, but maybe you have some other disadvantageous trait that makes you unlikely to reproduce. So no matter the fact that you're surviving, you're still not going to contribute your genes to evolution. So evolution has to have survival and reproduction. And then there's predation selection, which acts on both the predator and the prey. So as the predator evolves, then the prey is going to have to evolve in response. So this has created things like camouflage and mimicry and chemical defenses. So that way you can bite into a plant and you end up dying because the plant creates a lot of poisonous chemicals. It can make an organism faster or more likely to hide rather than to flee. So it affects a lot of different things. For example, if a plant is being eaten, if there's herbivory going on, well, the plant might then have an evolutionary drive that forms spines. Well, if there's now spines, that's going to affect which herbivores can eat it, or the herbivore is going to have to learn to adapt and eat around the spines. So they kind of cause each other to evolve based on how they respond to their own environment. Now, the effects of selection is that we tend to see a trait more highly favored or less favored in a particular population. So we're answering this question of how does the trait change in the population? So the first type of effect is directional selection, and this is where one extreme version of the trait is favored over the other versions. For example, here with fur color in mice, you have from the white mouse to the brown to the gray all the way down to black mice. And you have lots of different intermediary colors as well for mouse fur color traits. So directional selection says, well, this particular environment is going to favor darker colored mice. So we're going to shift and look, and only the traits with the darker coloration are going to survive. Or it could be the other way around. Only the traits with the lighter coloration are going to survive, like the peppered moth. Then you have something called stabilizing selection. This is where any extreme version of the trait is not favored, and only the intermediate traits are favored. So maybe being too lightly colored or too darkly colored makes you stand out in your environment, but if you're kind of a drab gray colored mouse, you're going to survive a lot better. An example of this is birth weight in humans. If you're too small when you're born, you're going to have a really hard time surviving. You need to have some level of body composition in order to survive the challenges of being a newborn with disease, with exposure to the elements, things like that. However, if you are too large of a baby, you may not be able to get through the birth canal and through the mother's pelvis, and you'll get stuck, and then both you and the mother will die. So extremely small and extremely large weights for human babies are no longer favored, or they never really were. They are not favored. Instead, an intermediate is favored, where they're not too small, they're not too big, they're right in the middle, kind of like Goldilocks. And then there is disruptive selection. This is where the extremes are favored and that intermediate is not favored. So being that drab gray mouse is actually detrimental, whereas being the white mouse or the black mouse, you're going to have a better time surviving and reproducing. So an example could be from the Galapagos with Darwin's finches. There's currently a multi-decade study going on with them, and we've seen the changes in their beak size through droughts and through flood situations. And during cases of drought, the intermediate sized beaks are not favored. You either need really large beaks to crack really dry, hard, large seeds, or you need smaller beaks to be able to get at more fine seeds or little tiny insects instead. So all of this comes to this last point here. There are no perfect organisms. A lot of people think, when they think of evolution, they think of that bumper sticker of the ape that slowly starts standing up and becomes the human. And that is not really correct. That implies that there's a striving for being upright and being human and all of that, that humans are the better organism compared to the ape. However, that's not true. Humans evolved to fit their particular environment. Apes still exist, so there's still a perfect environment for them to live in. Every organism is striving to be better for its environment. Evolution doesn't want perfect, it wants good enough. So if you are good enough to survive and reproduce in your environment, you're going to win the evolutionary game. And this idea of perfect is also a very strange argument as well. Perfect for what? One year, you could have a really great rainy season in California. Lots of flowers pop up, lots of plants are created or are grown, excuse me, and you're going to have lots of food as an organism. But then maybe the next 10 years are drought and you can't survive in that. So the environment is constantly changing. How are you going to be perfect for an environment that can be different at any moment? So why doesn't it create perfect organisms? Also because selection can only edit existing variations in our genetics. It can't create new things. It can't say, well, I want to be able to swim, so I'm going to create paddled hands so I can swim through the water better. It can only exist with what's there. You either have maybe a little bit more webbing between your fingers or you don't, and one of those is going to help you survive better or the other. We only tweak existing structures. So evolution is limited by every individual's historical constraints. Who did you evolve from? And often these adaptations that we have come with compromises. Yes, it was incredibly advantageous for humans to become upright and walking on two legs instead of four, because now two of our limbs are free to grasp and to do fine, dexterous work and to move around a lot faster through running. However, our pelvis is not really quite there yet with walking upright. And the way that the pelvis was formed through evolution of four-legged creatures, it creates a lot of back pain in humans. The example here on the bottom right shows, well, the cheetah's leg is quite long. Why don't we make it a little bit longer, because then it could go faster? Well, the longer you make this bone, the more fragile it becomes, the more likely it can break. So it's a trade-off. You want to maximize the trait that you want to maximize and minimize the damage that you cause as a result. So chance is still part of it all. You're dealing with, what genes am I given? You can't create the genes on your own. You just kind of got to take what you're given and work with that in your particular environment. So there are a few videos that I recommend when it comes to evolution. They're just really long for this class, so we don't have a lot of time to watch them together. If you're kind of a history buff and you want to understand how we came to this idea of natural selection, I really recommend this first video of how Darwin and Wallace came up with their ideas. If you want more evidence for natural selection and seeing it happen in real time and current studies, you can watch this one about the finches in the Galapagos, or this evolution of the rock pocket mouse. And if you just kind of want a very basic level review, so take what I just told you and distill it down to its bare minimum, I highly recommend you watch this Basics of Natural Selection video by the Amoeba Sisters. So that is it. If you have any questions for me, please join me in office hours. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great day.